On today's show, we're joined by Sarah Atherton, Member of Parliament for Wrexham, who's kindly agreed to come in and discuss the armed forces as to where we are today, any historical issues that we have had in the past that we're now addressing, and what's being done with veterans. So, hello, Sarah. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hello, David, and thank you for having me on your show again.
Very welcome. So, shall we start with the burning one now, is where we are today with the armed forces. And you're obviously connected through Parliament. You've been working a lot on various bodies working for the benefits of the armed forces, etc. Where do you actually see today that the roles and responsibilities are of the armed forces?
Yeah, thank you, David. Well, our armed forces are very much in focus at the moment with the atrocities we're seeing over in the Ukraine. So thank you for having me to talk about our armed forces. And, obviously, David, I was in the army myself back in the 80s, and I'm the only serving female MP with a regular military background. So I think because of that, I was elected on the Defence Select Committee. So I spend a lot of time looking at our military and our armed forces and our veterans. So it's a really good question that you've posed. What's the role and responsibility of our armed forces today? Well, in a nutshell, it's to defend the United Kingdom, her territories, her crown dependencies, and her interests abroad. But also as well, and we see this in Ukraine at the moment, and the work that the military are doing around in Poland to support international peacekeeping efforts and humanitarian aid. The head of the armed forces is our Queen, and the Secretary of State for Defence is Ben Wallace, who we see most mornings on our television at the moment, who, I have to say, is doing a brilliant job for and with the Ukraine. And he also did a really good job with what they call Operation Pitting, which was the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan. So what do the armed forces do? Well, they counter threats that are made to the United Kingdom. And of late, there has been quite a transformation in our armed forces from when I was in the military, and I don't know when you were in, David, but it was very much what they call now conventional warfare or kinetic warfare, which was boots on the ground, the old dad's army, battle tanks, and two armies fighting each other on a large plain. So that is what we're actually seeing in Ukraine, and that's quite an old perception of our military, because what we have now as well is what we call hybrid warfare. It's a little more nuanced. It's called sub-threshold, and it's what we see around cyber attacks, misinformation, interference in elections. So there's two elements to warfare now, and our military has to combat both of those on behalf of the United Kingdom and protecting its people and interests.
From the old conventional battlefield type things and the switch over now to more high tech, the level of manpower now, do you think it's now adequate enough for both defence and for conflict resolution?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? We have a recent report that the government has published called the Integrated Review, and that set out the modern threat-focused defence and military that the government think, along with NATO allies, think that we will face as a country in the future. And to back up the Integrated Review was an extra boost of £24 billion to the armed forces, with a NATO commitment of 2.2% of gross domestic product. And the Integrated Review did identify that Russia and China are our key adversaries. I don't think it quite appreciated that what we would see today, only a year or so later after its publication, was conventional warfare on the outskirts of Europe, in Europe. But the Integrated Review did identify that Russia is a threat. It did identify that MOD needs more money to counter that threat. But also what we must remember as well is that we've used the military for UK resilience, around support for MACA requests, military aid to civilian authorities. In fact, we still have military ambulance drivers in Wales. So we've had the military looking at supporting local authorities with the COVID. We also have the military supporting terrorism and counter drugs. We've also got the military supporting humanitarian aid and emergency disasters. Now we've got the military supporting Ukraine within Europe. So it's stretched quite thinly. And whilst the integrated review is looking at new technologies around the space domain and satellites and hypersonic weapons and the future combat air system and all these highfalutin terms and concepts and technology that we are going to need in the future, that's the future. And what we need today is boots on the ground, the old-fashioned hardware, battle tanks, armoured vehicles. So I think the military is stretched quite thin at the moment. And I think there's going to be what they call a capability gap between what we may need now and what we'll need in 10 years' time. So if you're asking me, do we need to see increased military numbers? Do we need to see more investment in the MOD, in the armed forces? At this moment in time, I'd be saying absolutely yes.
It's interesting because, as you just mentioned there, that the number of diverse tasks that the military take on, it can change week to week, month to month. And it gives that individual who's in that service, be it the Army, Air Force, Navy or Marines, a wide range of experience which can be transferred back out into society, into civilian life, which you would not necessarily get from a 9 till 5 run-of-the-mill job in civilian life. It is important to take that on board when a young person might be considering today to embark upon it. From the point of females and multicultural backgrounds joining the armed forces at this point in life, have you seen a marked improvement and a marked increase in that?
Yes, I have, but not as much as I'd like to see. So, I loved my time in the Army, and if I was young again, I would certainly be looking at the military as a future career. And the armed forces has transformed, it's modernized, and it still offers that adventure, the travel, the career progression. Importantly for younger people as well, the camaraderie and the sense of belonging and direction. It still offers all that, but now it recognizes that we have these new critical infrastructures, these new domains like space and cyber. We have new technology, new weaponry. So it does offer a lot more than it perhaps did back in the 80s when we were coming out of the last Cold War. But as far as diversity, women, LGBT, it's still a little bit behind the curve. And one of the things that I was asked to look at on the Defence Select Committee with my background was women in the armed forces and female veterans. And yet again, I think it was about the 4th or 5th year running, women had been overrepresented in the complaints system. And yet again, women had not met their recruitment targets of 15%, and it was hovering around 11 to 12%. And the questions were really, why is this happening? Why is the military, the MOD, not embracing this untapped resource of women in the military? And the target is 15% of recruitment, and it was nowhere near, and Capita were involved in that, and Capita have got a bit of a checkered history where recruitment's concerned. So I looked into that. I did an inquiry into women in the armed forces from recruitment to civilian life, and I was able to put out a survey on the Serving Women's Networks, courtesy of the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, who lifted what they call a DIN, Defence Instruction Notice, which actually forbids people in the military from talking about their service experience to people outside of the military. So, if I had someone serving in my constituency in Wrexham and they had a problem with their bins or a pothole, they can talk to me about it, but they can't talk to me about their day-to-day job. So that was lifted by the Secretary of State. And we put out a survey on the intranet systems within the military. We also took oral evidence, written evidence, and then evidence from ministers. And when we put the survey out, we put it out 2 weeks before Christmas. We thought maximum we'd get 400 respondents. And I've still got my military networks and my female network. So I sort of put the flag up there and said, come on, ladies, this is your chance, the first chance you have had to let me know what your experiences are. 2 weeks later, we had over 4,100 responses.
Phenomenal, really, when you consider, you say there, we consider it's close to Christmas and but it's interesting that people have actually taken the time and felt the need to complete that survey.
Well, there have been a number of research studies and a number of academics and a number of legal solicitors and barristers that had raised some concerns about the experience of women in the military. And we didn't just look at women, it was open to men as well, but by and large it was mainly women. But they didn't have that voice, they didn't have that position that I found myself in Parliament, where I could have access to the parliamentary process and the ministers. So what we actually found was, and this is a good bit of news, is 9 out of 10 women who responded would recommend that career for women. The good news was that 9 out of 10 women would recommend a career in the military, and as do I. And that's really good news, because the opportunities it can offer and provide are vast. And not only opportunities for training, adventure, camaraderie, career progression in the military, but they are now transferable skills where you can get qualifications to take out into the outside world, into Civvy Street, and then you can have your second career if you want, or like me, a third career, using those skills and attributes and qualities that you picked up in the army. So that was really, really good. But we also found some quite distressing reports of sexual assault and rape within the military, which was the other end of the spectrum, where women weren't being listened to. There was poor evidence of management of complaints and perpetrators of crime. And in fact, you are 4 to 6 times less likely to get a conviction for rape in a military court than you are in a civilian court. So these were some of the statistics and the evidence we were having to deal with. And I have to be honest, it was quite shocking. But then there's all the stuff in the middle as well. So, for example, women were saying when they were on deployment, they couldn't get hold of sanitary products. They were in Afghanistan and they had kit and body armor. So they were in crouching firing positions, shoulder to shoulder with male colleagues, and their body armor was made for a man. Of course, it couldn't fit across your boobs. It was heavy on your hips. It was causing scarring on the hips. And they were exposed. And at the end of the day, it was about operational effectiveness and health and safety and duty of care for these women. So these were sort of low-hanging fruits, which I cannot understand why the MOD had not addressed much sooner than it has. However, because of this report, I made 35 recommendations to the MOD, and they've taken on about 30 of them. Some of them were simple fixes. Why on earth, when you join the military, do you have uniform for men? You know, this is quite easy to do. Some of it was a little more weighted around family-friendly policies, wraparound childcare, particularly problematic with COVID and dual-serving couples. Menopause, postpartum fitness, pregnancy were all issues highlighted where the military quite hadn't got it right. They weren't focused enough. They haven't focused enough on providing that sort of support for women. And of course, what we were seeing in our evidence was 2 years after you went back, having had a child, you would leave because actually the environment didn't support you to go any further. Well, you know, what a waste. What a waste, and you know, for that woman's career, but for also the military. You know, we're losing good skills, good women, and you know, a taxpayer's investment also, if you want to look at it like that. So a lot of change has been made. Ultimately, it's about culture. I am finding as I go along that a lot of the sort of old uniform-wearing institutions tend to have a little problem with culture, the MOD in particular. And I'm really pleased that the Army had a reset day not so long ago based on the report, which they've called the Atherton report, which I'm quite proud about. That will be my legacy for the armed forces. They had a reset day looking at the Atherton report recommendations and looking at how they can change the culture. And like everything, you know, culture will change, but it will be slow, and it will require perhaps some of the older, more established personnel who have very set ways of thinking, for them to perhaps retire and younger people to come in. But we will get there. This report has been groundbreaking. It is a legacy. I'm very proud of it, and it has already started to make progress. But we haven't made the one piece of progress that I'd like to have made, which was for all cases of murder, manslaughter and rape to be heard in a civilian court. That is remaining in a military court. But you know what? That hasn't been put to bed yet. And I'm still hopeful that in the future I will continue to work on it, but I will hear that that's been changed.
It's reassuring to know that things are now moving forward from the report that you compiled and the recommendations now being taken on board, because it could well have just stayed dormant and these things would have continued in the way that they were doing. And I know for a fact from my own experience, I joined the army way back in 1977 as a boy soldier. And when I went to my first deployment in my unit overseas, there were, I would say, possibly on a camp of maybe 500 serving soldiers, there was possibly 4 to 5 female serving personnel with us. And they had what was deemed at the time were the administration type jobs, and they weren't allowed even to pick up arms. So now things have changed. It's an evolution. You have to do it because there's no difference anymore. And you made a point there with the body armor. That in itself, if you, even as a male soldier, if you've got the wrong body armor and that rides up and it interferes with where you're putting the weapon to shoot it, you're ineffective. You may as well not be there. And for a female to do that, I think is also ineffective. They may as well not be there because they haven't got the right equipment. It's interesting to know that there are things moving afoot. And I think it's also reassuring, Sarah, that if a young person goes home tonight and says, Mum, Dad, I'd like to join the armed forces, that they're not shocked into the fact that that could well be happening. Moving on then, historically the issues we've had in the past, they're now being addressed quite severely, and things are changing. Do you think it will change or take change for the next couple of years? Do you think it'll take a long time to get that in?
Oh, things are absolutely changing, and this report has been a catalyst. It's been sobering for the MOD. You know, they've had no choice. They couldn't, not appreciate what I was saying, mainly because of the position I was in and the noise I was making on behalf of these 4,200 women. And I felt, it wasn't comfortable to do this. I did receive some pushback from the MOD initially. The ministers were superb with me over it, but it wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't comfortable to do it in Parliament. But, I had a duty to these women. I had a duty because I have also served. I didn't see that much, but, it was a harsh environment for a woman to be in. And as my mother would say, it wouldn't be worth having if it wasn't difficult to get. So it wasn't an easy profession, but I had a duty to do that and to see it through. And the MOD have had to swallow it and embrace it. And, I have used the media to make sure that it is up there and remains on the table, so it can't be pushed or kicked into the long grass. But things have changed. I'm going to review it in a year. I have my female networks that are also making sure it is kept on the table, it is kept as a high priority, and that we can build on this going forward, because it's about, British standards of quality and fairness, but ultimately it's about operational effectiveness and offering this as an amazing career for women where, the average service was 8 years. Well, I would like to think women can stay for 22, if not more. And it's such opportunities there. As I said before, I would rejoin tomorrow if I was certainly young enough I could run 2 miles, which I can't anymore. And it's really, really important that we embrace diversity. We embrace difference. Now, that's not woking up the army, which has been a criticism. It's absolutely not woking up the army. It's just making sure that women have the same opportunities, are on the same level playing field as their male counterparts. And I have to say, younger people are far more engaged with this than perhaps people of our generation. So we are getting there. It's going to be slow because cultural change always takes time.
Well, it goes without saying then, Sarah, that anybody that has to leave the armed forces now through pressure from one way or another, internal pressure this is from the armed forces, you would obviously recommend that they take that legal step and look for an unfair dismissal. And is there a mechanism for that in place now? Do people know where to go to if they feel that, or would they need to go to a civil lawyer?
No. Initially, one of the big changes that has been made by the military in response to the report is if you have a complaint in the military, whether you're male or female, about any sexual complaint, any sexual assault, you do not now have to go to your chain of command. You can now go to an independent body, and it's on the intranet system. You can link in, make a complaint, and it goes independently of your chain of command. Because what we were finding was quite often the chain of command was a stumbling block, if not a perpetrator. And that's where the difficulties were, because there was the old boy network or the cookhouse mentality of it all. And actually we were finding that women who were making a complaint, sometimes ended up having complaints made against them, and they were worse off whilst not receiving the victim support that they should be receiving. So the chain of command has now been removed. So on the internet system, you can make a complaint. There's also the Service Complaints Commissioner you can make a complaint to if you're serving. And then if you're not serving, the routes you have then are the Armed Forces Ombudsman, if it's a retrospective complaint, or you can take legal advice. There are quite a few specialist lawyers out there, or you can go to one of the many armed forces charities that certainly help veterans.
Well, it's nice to know that there is now a different mechanism rather than, as you say, the chain of command, where quite often it was covered over, or there was then put a vendetta against an individual for raising their concerns. So moving on now to the more things that are closer to my heart and maybe your heart, are the veterans. We see quite often on the TV various things that veterans are doing to support various charities and what have you, but often than not, they're forgotten in some cases, and it's difficult to change that sort of historical path. Do you think that anything is changing for them?
I think veterans over the last 10 years, I think a lot has changed within the veteran domain. So we've got the Armed Forces Covenant, which is now in legislation, and it ensures that no veteran and their families are disadvantaged through serving their country. And it is a superb piece of legislation. And it puts obligations on organisations to support veterans and their families. It is an absolute starting block in which I think we can build on as we go forward. So it covers domains like education, and it offers the pupil premium. Of course, families moving around a lot, it's very disruptive for children's education. So it means that they can get priority in school placements to try and have some continuity of service children's education. It's around housing, and it gives serving personnel and veterans priority for government-sponsored affordable housing schemes, or if they're going to be discharged, they have a priority on state housing lists. And it also covers healthcare. The slight nuance here is that it's designed not to disadvantage veterans and service personnel. Unlike America, where you would be advantaged for being a serving personnel or veteran. This is to make sure you're not disadvantaged, except in the area where you perhaps have medical needs as a consequence of your service. And therefore, there you are advantaged if it's deemed as clinically necessary. So these are three areas. I think we can build on that. I think we can build on that around criminal justice, particularly with the Sean Stoker wing that we have in HMP Berwyn in Wrexham, which I'm quite involved with there, and looking at the amount of service personnel that come out, are homeless, live on our streets, have drug and alcohol issues, I think, and then ultimately slip into the criminal justice system. I think we can do perhaps a little more around there going forward, but this is a great starting block. It also looks at transition out of the military and identifies for each personnel that's leaving, whether they have any training, education, financial, healthcare needs. It assists them with job finding, and we know that a lot of businesses are signed up to the covenant, and it guarantees interviews for civil service jobs. So we're making massive headway on support for veterans. There is more to go, but we're making good headway. And then after service, for example, there are 50 Armed Forces champions embedded in the Department of Works and Pensions. I've met the lady that's in Wrexham. She's extremely good. She's a spouse, Armed Forces spouse herself, and they're there to identify veterans' needs as they go into this sort of looking at finances and debt and DWP, Department of Works and Pensions. So this is all laid out what we're doing for veterans. It's made it statute, it's in law. There's a duty to provide for veterans. I think it can go further, as I said, with the criminal justice system. There is some concern that I see over, again, what is a duty? You know, if you've got someone that's really vested in veterans and veteran support in the military, the services can be absolutely superb. If people aren't as vested in veterans, you know, the service can be a little bit tokenistic. So it's only as good as the person behind delivering that service. But we are making headway with that. We've got the Veterans Rail Card. I've got mine. It's saving me a fortune. We've got the Veterans Gateway. There's 1,800 odd veterans charities in the UK. There's been a lot of support going forward following the withdrawal of Afghanistan and the pressure that put on veterans' mental health to give more money to these veterans charities to support veterans during that time. So, and of course, we've got veterans commissioners. So we've got one in Scotland, England, Northern Ireland. The UK government gave the Welsh government some money to look at veteran support. Welsh government decided they would not fund a veterans commissioner, which I thought was a shame because it gave a strategic overview to the service provision and the situation for veterans in the UK. It didn't do that, the Welsh government. What it decided to do was to have regional coordinators. And I'd lobbied the government hard, feeling that we did need in Wales that strategic oversight of that one person that can meet with the other three people, the other three commissioners, and look at the veterans picture for the UK. So I'm really pleased that the Wales office and the Cabinet office have now funded and employed a Veterans Commissioner for Wales. So that's really good. Mental health. You know, I've got a real concern here about mental health for our veterans. And, you know, I've got a concern as we go forward with the integrated review I mentioned before about the opportunities for more global reach of our military, more persistent deployments, longer deployments, more sustainable, lethality and all this terminology. What impact is all this going to have on mental health going forward? There is some research being done around the mental health and the social situation of people before they go into the military. The military is a very regimented, strict lifestyle. But when they come out, there's a correlation between their lifestyle before they go in the military and when they come out. And I think that's going to be really interesting to look at recruitment going forward and the outcomes of mental health. So that's something to watch. But, you know, as an MP with a background in nursing and social work as well, I'm a little bit concerned about what I see as the disparities between veteran provision in England and just over the border in Wales. For example, with the devolution settlement, the UK government, a lot of the services given to veterans is provided through the Welsh government through the devolved process. So the money is given to the Welsh government to provide that. So, for example, Op Courage, which is an NHS England initiative to support mental health of serving personnel and veterans in England, has not been replicated in Wales. So if you have mental health problems in Wales, you go to your GP, as we would all go through our GP. And we know that mental health provision in Wrexham is very patchy. So there is a disparity there that I see between a veteran getting mental health support for PTSD in Chester compared to Wrexham, and that is a concern of mine, and this is why we do need, and I'm pleased we have got a Veterans Commissioner. But we do good things in Wrexham. The ALAC service, the Artificial Limb and Appliance Centre, is second to none. It's absolutely superb, state-of-the-art replacement limbs. But if you want pain relief for that amputation, you could be waiting 2 years. So, you know, there's pros and cons really with the service for veterans in Wrexham. We've got some great third sector support in Wrexham. Royal British Legion, I'm really sad that they're losing their office in town. But we've got Woodies, we've got Care After Combat, we've got some great social associations like the Welsh Fusilier Comrades Association, the Royal Naval and the Artillery Association locally supporting each other, peer support. And I'm really pleased that I've worked with Ian Donnelly, who's the CEO at the Myler, and I found some funding, a pot of funding that he applied for, secured to put in place, and he's just recruited someone, for a covenant coordinator for 2 years, sat at the miler to identify veterans as they go into hospital to make sure that they are not disadvantaged, that the covenant is being followed, and that they are supported through their inpatient journey within the hospital, and then to signpost people out the other end. So there's some really good work going on. But, like all things, it depends on the person that's behind it and driving it.
It's quite reassuring what you just said there, Sarah, that there are now things in place for veterans as they leave the military and they come into civilian life, that there are things there already in place, and hoping that they're actually given that advice as they leave. I know from my experience, I only did 15 years, and when I left on a Friday, and they all said goodbye. And on a Monday morning, I was in a job in Civvy Street, and there was not one connection back to the military for me unless I made that step to go and find it. Going through sort of veterans groups and friendship groups, that sort of thing. And it is quite alarming when you step out of the military just how different civilian life is, and there's no two ways about it. But I do think with all the welfare groups that are there now, we can all access to fine media, etc. The amount of support for things such as you mentioned there, the rail cards and the Veterans Gateway, Forces discount cards, there's all those sort of things there that really do make a difference to a veteran when they step out and they need that sort of back arm of comfort when they come out, because they do lose that massive bond that links them all together.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the government has recognised that they needed to do more with veterans. And I really genuinely believe that they've made massive headway. Do I think we could do more? Of course we can. Of course we can, as we evolve, and we can build on that. But, 10 million extra has been offered to the veterans charities to try and support veterans. It would be interesting to see. We had a peak of veterans that needed support after the withdrawal from Kabul, and I'm wondering what's going to happen now with what we're seeing in the Ukraine. But, we've got a veterans strategy action plan, which does for the first time identify female veterans. So they are now a specific group that have been identified, which is really good, because it was one of my recommendations that female veterans aren't valued enough, but also recognises veterans from ethnic minorities, non-UK veterans, Commonwealth veterans, and LGBT veterans as well. So, headway is being made. We've had the Overseas Operations Act, which protects veterans from vexatious claims when they've been on overseas deployments. They've got the outstanding issue of Northern Ireland, which is ongoing, which I'm involved with the Northern Ireland office, and that's trying to be worked through. And of course, the government's just ceased visa payments for Commonwealth veterans who want to stay in this country. And there was quite a few of my colleagues, including myself, that were lobbying hard behind the scenes so Commonwealth soldiers didn't have to pay, nor their families pay, the very large visa costs involved with them wanting to stay in this country. So we are making headway. It's really good. Better times than when we left.
Indeed. Well, Sarah, thank you very much for taking the time today to come and chat to us about the armed forces. Obviously, we know a lot more now than we did at the beginning, and we obviously welcome you back again if there's any more developments within the armed forces discussion, plus also your regular monthly updates, which we all look forward to as well. So thank you very much indeed.
No, thank you for your time. Thank you for listening.